Now we're cool.
So let me say that again. When it comes to all the supernatural beings of the Old Testament, God is, again, we would say he's species unique. There's no one like him. Even though there are other supernatural beings, there's only one God of all gods. There's only one creator. There's only one Yahweh. And we've seen that he is not only creator, but we see him showing himself as the angel of the Lord. He's mentioned, many times he's called the visible Yahweh. He comes and meets with Abraham and Joshua and different Old Testament people. And we said that's like the pre-incarnate Christ. When you see Christ in the Old Testament, that's how you see him. But in a very similar way that we see him in the New Testament, he shows up. He's there. In fact, we see in different examples where he actually has a meal with, and so there's again these kind of incredible ways that God shows himself and personally. So tonight we want to pick up on what God is doing in the Old Testament when it comes to reversing some of the wickedness that happens in the Old Testament. So I want to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 32, and let's kind of recap where we are in this whole narrative of the Old Testament. We begin by rehearsing the storyline. You might remember, as we've read, if you ask a Jewish person, what's the cause of all the bad things happening in the world? Why is sin a reality? Why do people do bad things and terrorists strike innocent people? Why does all this bad stuff happen in the world? And they would say, well, like we would say, we'd probably say the fall of Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. But they would also point to Genesis 6, where these fallen supernatural beings corrupted humanity with their offspring of the Nephilim. And then what happened at the Tower of Babel, where God said, be fruitful and multiply, and yet humanity decided, no, we're going to stay in one place. We're going to make ourselves a great empire. And so, as a result of that, we get Deuteronomy 32. So let's look at that. It says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. Sons of God meaning those supernatural beings that led rebellion, that incited rebellion. But he says, but the Lord's portion is his people. And who's God's people? It says Jacob, his allotted heritage. Now who's Jacob? Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. In the Old Testament, God was known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, they are the patriarchs of the Jewish people. And so God made Israel his people. What else did he do with the rest of the nations of the earth? He gave them up to be ruled by these supernatural beings. He gave them, because of their rebellion, God gave them up. He disinherited the nations. Now, that's important. That comes in Genesis 9, 10, and 11. What happens in Genesis 12? That's where God calls Abraham. He says, I'm going to make you a great nation. You're going to be a blessing to in fact, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed because of you. So even then, what is God saying? Is God saying it's a lost cause? I'm not going to give these nations any hope. I'm just going to disinherit them? No. He wants to bless them, and he says, I'm going to bless you through Abraham. So, Psalm 82, we've read that. We're not going to read it tonight, but you might remember, that's in Psalm 82, that's where God looks at what we call his divine council, this assembly of supernatural beings, and he says, you're going to be judged. because you incited wickedness. You helped mankind along in their sin and helped them do it even better. And you have seen them oppressed, and you have seen them wounded and hurt. And so you're going to be judged because of that. You don't love them the way I love them. You want to rule over them and you want to hurt them. And so now you're going to be judged because of that. And you can read about that in Psalm 82. But God is making it clear that they're going to be judged for what they've done. In fact, they would be eventually stripped of authority. Their worship would cease. But it would have to require this confrontation. Right? God was going to confront the wicked, we might call them the gods, those supernatural beings. And so, from the moment that Israel came into existence, when God called Abraham, now there's the clash. That is where the conflict is going to center. So, where does God begin to contest with and confront these supernatural beings? It starts in Egypt. It starts in Egypt. So look how God foretold this. I've already covered all of this. In Genesis chapter 15, look at verse 13. The Lord said to Abram, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there." Now this is God speaking prophetically to say this is what's going to happen. Your people are going into a land that's not theirs, and they're going to become servants. A better way to understand that is they're going to be slaves. They're not going to be free people. They're going to be oppressed people. And they will be afflicted for 400 years, but I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now who is that nation that God is speaking of, where Israel is going to be slaves, but yet they're going to, after 400 years, they're going to come out with great blessing and possession? Who is that nation? You know it. I mean, everyone's seen the movie. Egypt. Now see, you knew that. You wouldn't say it because you don't trust yourself. Well, Johnny said it.
She did.
Okay. Egypt. Yeah, Egypt. So, here's the thing. God's ahead of the game. He knows what's going to happen, and he's prepared his response to it. So, we continue. He says, "As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age." He's giving Abraham this coming. He says, "It's not going to happen to you, but it's going to happen to your people. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." And I don't want to get into all that. But here God is saying they're going to go away, but they're going to come back blessed. Okay? So, what happens? Well, again, Israel's descent into Egypt was a setup. It was God confronting not just Egypt, but confronting the gods of Egypt. Now, it's funny. In the Middle East, you have historically two religions that have been monotheistic. That's the Jewish people and the Muslim people. Uniquely, where do they both come from? You know where the Muslim trace their descendants? You know where they claim to come from? Abraham. Do you know that? Okay, but all the other nations around them are, now, I'll tell you this, that honestly, the God that Muhammad worshipped was actually the moon god. Now, we're not going to get into all that tonight. But he claimed that the moon god was the one true God. And that's a misnomer. Many people think that Allah is just the Muslim version of our Yahweh. That's not the case. but nevertheless they claim to be monotheistic. The thing is that the other nations, they had whole pantheons of gods. How many have heard about the Greek gods, like Zeus? And those, there's a pantheon. Did you know the same thing was true of, like, the Assyrians? They didn't call him Zeus, but they had their own god. You know what they called him? Baal. But Baal is one and probably the leader of what they would consider a pantheon of the gods. And on and on and on. Even up to the Romans, who had the same pantheon. Jupiter was their Zeus, and then, they have, when I say pantheon, we're talking basically a hall of the gods. Like the ones that are the gods, and they rule. Well, Egypt's got the same thing. Different names, different characteristics assigned to their gods, but basically a pantheon. And so, again, all of these pagan nations were pagan because they served multiple gods. Right? So the same is true of Egypt, and that's where God chooses his first confrontation. And so God sends his people into Egypt, and that's how the book of Genesis ends. And so Exodus opens. In Exodus chapter 1, we begin to hear the plight, just as God foretold. The Egyptians began to oppress the Jews. And what did God do? He raised up Moses. And in Exodus 4, he appears to Moses at the burning bush, calls Moses and says, "Go to tell Pharaoh, let my people go." He goes, and then you get this verse in Exodus 5:2. Pharaoh says, he hears this, he says, "Who is the Lord? Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" Now the thing is that Pharaoh is an earthly king, but he claims a supernatural origin. He claims to be a son of the gods. Now that's probably just a way of the line of the pharaohs kind of cementing their own legacy by saying that we are the descendants of the gods, so that's why we rule. Right? We've got the pedigree here. So Pharaoh's question, when Moses says, "Let my people go," is what? Who's the Lord? Who's the Lord? And so, here's what we learned. Is that God is not just confronting Pharaoh, an earthly king, to see his people set free. Watch this. Exodus 12:12. God says, "Listen, on all of the gods of Egypt, I'm going to execute judgment." What were those judgments? The plagues. Now, every one of the plagues were a direct hand to the face of the deities of the Egyptians. For example, look at some that I put up here. The Nile turning to blood. Well, guess who was considered the spirit of the Nile? The god of the Nile. Hapi. So the lifeblood of Egypt was the Nile River. What happens when the people were blessed? They would give tribute, they would give praise to this God. Now Moses comes along and says, "Look, you're not going to let God's people go. God's going to bring devastation on your main source of water. You're the lifeblood of your crops and your agriculture." God turned into blood. Darkness. Well, Ra was the sun god. He's kind of like their Zeus, believe it or not. Their sun god. And then the death of the firstborn. Remember who Pharaoh was, claimed to be. a descendant of God, a literal son of God. And remember that one of the firstborn children that died was Pharaoh's own. What's God doing? He's saying, I rule, and I'm executing judgment upon the gods. So the plagues were not just random disasters, they were specific, they were intentional to confront these supernatural beings. So again, this was a cosmic dethronement. And remember Israel coming out? Eventually Pharaoh says, I've got to let him go, especially after the last plague, which introduced Passover. Well, as Israel is coming out, and Pharaoh has said, God has answered, well, who is the Lord? Well, he's the Lord that can defeat your river god. He's the God that can defeat your sun god. He's the God that can defeat Pharaoh himself, who claims to be a descendant of the gods. So Israel comes out, and what happens? Well, the nations heard about it. People in the nations, and who do those nations belong to? Other gods. Just like Deuteronomy 32 says. God has disinherited the nations, giving them to these other supernatural beings, these sons of God. And so Pharaoh's who is the Lord? Well, here they come. You're going to find out who he is. You're going to find who he is in the exodus of his people. So watch what happens. You remember Jethro? Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. And Moses was having quite the time trying to wrangle all these people and make sure their needs were met and make decisions for everybody. And so Jethro comes to him, and Jethro has to give him some counsel. So look, you got to help yourself here. You've got to do right by these people. And you need to raise up other people to have authority so you can manage these people. And here's the reason why he says that. He says, I know the Lord is greater than all the gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with the people. In other words, he says, what is happening here is a supreme redemption of God working. And Moses, you've got to make sure that you care for these people, because these are God's people. These are God's people. And he's dealt arrogantly. He has dealt powerfully and arrogantly with those people that oppressed him. So you got to take care of them. And then you might remember this in Joshua chapter 2. As Joshua, this is 40 years later now, and Joshua is going into the promised land with God's people, and they go to Jericho, and they've sent spies to Jericho to check it out. And so Rahab says, I'm going to help you out. And this is Rahab. She says, or before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you the land. I know the Lord's given you this land. And the fear of you has fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of the land melt before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, and to Sihon and Og. Og was a king, and more than likely, he himself was a Nephilim. There are reports of Og's bed. In fact, you can look this up. Og's bed was the bed that would accommodate the size of a very large individual. So Og himself is one of, I believe, a descendant of the Nephilim. You think of Goliath, think of Og. And what is Rahab saying? God's not giving any quarter, right, to the pagans and to the gods, the pagan gods. He is opening the way for his people. So this is a direct confrontation, and even the other people in the nations are hearing this, and they're giving glory to God because of it. So Moses, at some point, after the Red Sea, he begins to taunt and declare how great God is. And he says, "Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods?" Why would he have to say that? If it's not a direct confrontation. He could say, who is like you, O Lord, who's done wondrous things, who's rescued us from the land of Egypt, who opened the Red Sea to us, who brought us up by plagues. No, he's very specific. He says, no one else is like you. Who is like you among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds and doing wonders? So, again, Moses knows this, that God is making his mark against those pagan deities. And so the Exodus, everything that God has done in the Exodus, taking his people out of Egypt. Remember Pharaoh's question, who is the Lord? This is who he is. This is who he is. So, what happens to Israel is they're coming out of Egypt, they come to Mount Sinai. Anyone know what God did for the people at Mount Sinai? He gave them something. Remember what it was? The Ten Commandments, right? The tablets with the law of God on them. So Israel didn't just leave Egypt to become free only. They were being escorted into a covenant relationship with God. Just like God had said to Moses, they're going to go in, they're going to be oppressed for 400 years, but then they're going to come out, and they're going to come out with possessions and blessing. And so God is bringing them to Mount Sinai, and they come to, again, Sinai is not simple geography. Remember, in the minds of the Jewish people, the gods lived on the mountains. And so where does God bring his people? To a mountain. To an encounter. To a place where they can experience his holiness and his power. And so when they come to Sinai, God is going to give them the tablets. But look back at, we'll see there's a slide again. Let me show it to you. But this is God bringing his people into covenant relationship. This is God's first reclaiming of a family. That's what redemption is about. If I could stress this again, that even the gospel is not just about getting souls into the kingdom, it's about getting people into a spiritual family. That's what the gospel's about. And so here you see God bringing the people to Sinai to make them a family. In fact, if you go back to what God is speaking, what Moses speaks to Pharaoh, he said this. He says, "You shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is what? Israel is my firstborn son." My firstborn. Does that imply there are other sons to follow? Israel's just the first. God's going to have more children. And so he brings them to Mount Sinai. He gives them the Ten Commandments, establishes a brand new covenant. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? And so after Babel, remember the plan was narrowed to one lineage. All the other nations belong to the gods except Israel. Who does Israel belong to? Yahweh. The one true God. But they're not going to be the only ones, are they? They're just the firstborn. So, again, this is family language. This is covenant language. But what does this have to do with God giving the law? Well, let's look at a couple of things. A lot of times when you see the giving of the law, we just think, well, it's God and Moses, right? I mean, they're up on the mountain. In fact, the people were down at the bottom of the mountain and got fearful because Moses was gone for so long. But look at what the New Testament says about the giving of the law. Turn to Acts chapter 7 and look at verse 53. Now, this is in the middle of a sermon that Stephen is one of the first deacons, and Stephen is preaching, and Stephen is he's not holding back. He sees he's preaching a very Jewish message. He's preaching to the unbelieving Jewish people, and he says, you know, you received the law delivered by angels. You received the law of God in a supernatural way. You received the law of God in a supernatural encounter. Hebrews says it this way. I'm sorry, Deuteronomy chapter 9. When I went up on the mountain to receive the tablets of some of the tablets of the covenant the Lord made with you, I remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights and neither ate bread nor drank water. And the Lord gave me 2 tablets of stone written with the finger of God. Now, again, it's been a while since we've been here. But the last time we were here, I said that, you know, when God appeared to Moses, he had to shield it. He couldn't just unleash his full glory for Moses. Because in the New Testament, in 2 Timothy, it says, God himself dwells in unapproachable light. He can't be beheld by human physical eyes that will survive the moment. And so God availed himself so that people can encounter him in ways that were human. Okay? Like the angel of the Lord appeared. And this is another account. How did the tablets come the way Moses describes? The finger of God. Now I know if you've seen the 10 Commandments, you saw this flame of fire come from the heavens and carve out the stone. I don't think that's consistent with what Moses says. I think Moses is basically saying that God appeared in a very human way, in a way that he could be seen without us dying. And with the finger of God. Now, I do believe, just as the New Testament says, that angels, right, these divine supernatural beings accompanied God in this moment of giving the law. I mean, this was a supernatural encounter. I think I have Exodus 24, 9-11. Then Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 other elders went up, and they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of God's people. And they beheld God, and they ate and drank. Now, here's the thing. In the New Testament describes God as a spirit. Jesus says that. He says, God is a spirit, and those who worship him in spirit and truth. But again, here you have this description where Moses said, we beheld him, and what did we share? We shared food together. Again, so I believe this was a divine appearing of again, the visible Yahweh. The second person of the Trinity. I think what you read here is Jesus showing up, pre-incarnate. Not the New Testament, born as a babe in the manger of Bethlehem, growing up for 33 years, tempted like we are. I'm just saying that it seems to be in the Old Testament when God wanted to appear to his people personally. He showed up humanly. Again, the finger of God that gave the tablets of stone, and then this. What does that tell us? Well, listen, what that tells us is that God is not this divine force, right? What is the thing that people, that skeptics will say about God? Well, why would you believe in a God you can't see? Well, in the Old Testament, they saw him. He wasn't unseen. He made himself known. And what is our record of God having shown up for us? It's Jesus. It's the New Testament. So, first of all, I want you to see how many elders are here. Does it tell us? How many elders? 70. I want to suggest to you that's a very specific number. It's not just this random number, all right? They didn't just have 70 spaces up at the top of the mountain. This was 70 for a very specific purpose. Let me draw some parallels for you. In the book of Luke, again, this is Jesus having shown up. You might remember this. First, Jesus sent, in Luke 9, Jesus commissions the disciples. He gives them power. He says, go, heal the sick, preach the gospel, cast out devils. But then in Luke 10, he does the same thing for 70 other followers. 70. Why is that important? Well, if you go back to Genesis, from the Tower of Babel, Genesis 9, and then chapter 10 and chapter 11. Genesis 10, guess how many nations are listed that were disinherited and given to the gods of the earth, the supernatural, rebellious sons of God? Guess how many? 70. 70. So even back in the Old Testament, God still has his mind on those 70 nations that are under the grip of darkness. That's a very specific thing. Jesus is very intentional about that in Luke 10. Let me give you another thing that might blow your mind. So, remember what happened to the Apostle Paul as he began to preach the gospel? He got closer to Rome, and but what's going to happen to him in Rome? He was arrested in Jerusalem, sent to Rome, and he's under house arrest. Okay? Watch this in Romans 15. It's kind of long, but I want you to see this. He's under house arrest, and he writes these words. He says, at present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. I'm sorry, this is before the imprisonment, and he's about to be arrested. He says, at present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints from Macedonia and Achaia. This is like Philippi and Corinth. They gave really nice offerings for the poor believers in Jerusalem. So he says, for Macedonia and Achaia, they pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints of Jerusalem. They were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. Think about that. These pagan lands of people that have come to faith in Jesus, we built churches in these areas. And they've given money for the poor, struggling saints, the early church that began in Jerusalem. And Paul says, they kind of owe it to them. Why do they owe it to them? Because it's through Israel. The Jewish believers in Acts chapter 2 that now the gospel has gone beyond Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. Where is it going? It's going to the earth. It's going to the nations. Now, watch this. We're not done yet. For if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessing, they also ought to be of service to them in material blessings. What is he saying? He says, look, the Gentiles are sharing in this. Where are those blessings? Where were they first promised? Abraham, right? It's through you all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And so Paul says that the Gentiles have come to share in these spiritual blessings. You know what? They ought to help the people in Jerusalem with some material blessings. When therefore I have completed this and have delivered to them what has been collected, I will leave for where? Spain. Spain by way of you. Keep on. No, we're done. Okay. I thought I had another verse. Look at what Paul's saying. He says, okay, I'm going to bring this money to Jerusalem, and after I leave there, I'm coming to you, and then on my way to Spain. One of the nations, it's the last nation mentioned in Genesis 10, where God says, I'm disinheriting the nations, and those nations were listed there. How many? 70. The last one mentioned is this place called Tarshish. Geographically, do you know where Tarshish is? It's that last bit of land way on the other far end, way past Rome, way past Rome till you get as far as you can go to the Mediterranean, at the end of the Mediterranean Sea, before it dips into the Atlantic. That was the known world. It's that space, that tip there. Do you know what that is? Spain. Geographically, Tarshish was a reference to Spain. What is Paul saying? He says, all right, people have told me if I go back to Jerusalem that I'll be arrested. You can read that. In fact, it says that in Acts chapter 20. And in fact, when Paul went and met with the Ephesian church and elders before he actually got back to Jerusalem, they wept with him. They said, please don't go. You mean so much to us, and if you go to Jerusalem, they're going to arrest you. The Jews are going to arrest you. And there's a plot against your life. And look what Paul's saying to the Romans as he's making this journey. He says, I know what awaits me in Jerusalem, but I'm planning on coming to you, and then I'm going to go to Spain. And you know what happened historically? This comes to us outside the New Testament. We end the book of Acts, and Paul was under house arrest. But somewhere between house arrest and his final execution by Rome, he was allowed to go to Spain. So when God says, Abraham, your people are going to go into bondage, but don't forget, I've made a promise to you that it's through you all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And God is always one step ahead. It doesn't matter what darkness does. It doesn't matter what spiritual wickedness desires to do. God's going to fulfill his plan. Keep going. So how do we, what does this mean for us? What are some of the implications for us? Well, let's remember a couple things. The law doesn't save anybody, does it? In fact, the Bible teaches us that the law reveals our sin. The law doesn't save us, right? The law tells us God's holy standard. Don't have gods before him, that's the first one. Don't covet, don't steal, don't murder. But nobody can keep the law perfectly, can they? No, that reveals our sin. And yet, the law is meant to show us that that God expects our reverence for him. The law shows us that even though it doesn't save us, it expresses God's will for us. So what does God want from us? Well, he wants loyalty. He wants reverence. And if you start with the first law, don't have any other gods before me. It's loyalty. Keep your allegiance to me, Israel. Don't turn aside to other gods. And that became a problem for them in their history. But God's desire is that we stay loyal to him. Now, think of some of the most extravagant failures in Israel's history. Think of the people that just, really messed up. What are some of the most spectacular failures that you can think of in the Old Testament? Who? David. Yeah, think about what David did. This man after God's heart slew Goliath, becomes king, moves the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, establishes a place where people can worship God. And yet, David has some spectacular failures. One is his adultery with Bathsheba. And then, to cover it up, he ended up having her husband killed. Those are death sentences. Really, the law required death. So King David's life illustrates that principle. Again, he deserved death, but what didn't he do? He didn't transfer his loyalty. He didn't go after other gods. His son did. He had descendants who did that. Solomon went after other gods. David never did. And so I think there's something that we need to remember here. All right, failure. Failure is not the same as apostasy. Failure is not the same as turning from God. There's a difference there. And so the New Testament preserves that pattern that is Acts 4:12. There is salvation in no one else. You can't look to anyone else to be saved. For there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. There's only one name. And that's Jesus. So we put our faith in him. Hebrews 3:19 says, see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. Who is he speaking of? Well, when they came to the promised land, the first time, in Numbers 13, Joshua and Caleb, they said, you know what, God's going to give it to us. But the other spies, you know what they said? We can't. Why? Because of the giants in that land. We can't go because of the giants. Was that faith? No, that was unbelief. That was unbelief. Hebrews 10:38 says, my righteous shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not those who shrink back and are destroyed, but those who have faith and preserve their souls. So it's not just allegiance, it's continued allegiance, it's continued loyalty, it's enduring faith. We're going to believe what God has said. We're going to believe what God wants to do. And because of that, we have a role in God's continuing plan. We have a role in continuing to see God's kingdom extended. So this means the mission for us continues. Galatians 3:26, he says, "For in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith." Remember I've said that the New Testament writers understood the Old Testament? In fact, the way they understand the world is because of the Old Testament. So when Paul, you think it's an accident that Paul says, you know, you're sons of God through faith? You hear Paul, that's like a poke in the eye to those Old Testament rebellious, supernatural sons of God. You're sons of God through faith. For as many as you were baptized into Christ, to put on Christ. There is neither Jew or Greek, slave or free. There is no male or female. You're all one in Christ Jesus. And if you're all Christ, then you're all Abraham's offspring according to the promise. You remember what Moses tells Pharaoh? He says, all right, you got to let him go. Because God says these are his firstborn. And now, who are we? We're the rest of God's children. We're the rest of God's sons. And where do we come from? You know, I just want to tell you, you don't have to probably take a DNA test to know that you're probably from other places other than Jerusalem. Now, you might have some Jerusalem in you. You may have some Jewish in your bloodline, but guess what else you got in your bloodline? For me, I've got Irish and Scottish and German and Welsh, and I got a lot in mine. That's why I'm so mixed up. But you know where my bloodline comes from? Those nations that God redeemed. That God reclaimed. And you are too. And so we have an inheritance. If you belong to Christ, then you're Abraham's offspring. Now, a couple of things to consider. Without Israel, that's how it started, but without Israel, there can be no Messiah. Without Messiah, there can be no reclaimed humanity. There can be no redemption. But watch this. Without reclaimed humanity, there can't be any restored dominion. What is God doing for his people?